Americans are quietly witnessing the collapse of something that once felt unshakable. Restaurant prices have surged 30% to 80% since 2019. Inflation at eateries is running nearly twice as high as grocery inflation, and chains once considered affordable are now luxury purchases for struggling families. Fast food giants are closing hundreds of locations. Over 1.1 million workers have already lost their jobs this year, and yet we're still told this is the strongest economy in history. What's happening right now isn't a slowdown, it's a structural breakdown, and it's accelerating faster than anyone wants to admit. Restaurant inflation has become one of the most brutal and least understood forces crushing the American consumer. While overall inflation has slowed on paper, the cost of eating out has surged at nearly twice the rate of grocery inflation, creating a gap so wide that millions simply walked away. From 2019 to 2025, menu prices didn't just rise, they exploded by 30% to 80%, depending on the chain and the item. That's not normal inflation, that's a structural break in affordability. For a country where 35% of adults used to eat out twice a week, this shift is massive. Restaurant spending was one of the last discretionary habits households held onto, even during tough times. But the moment menu prices grew faster than wages, the entire foundation cracked. Americans didn't suddenly stop liking restaurants. They simply couldn't justify paying $15 for a meal that cost $9 a few years ago, or $26 for a dish that used to be under $18. The psychological threshold snapped. Behind those prices are realities consumers don't see: skyrocketing labor costs, higher insurance premiums, rent increases, energy spikes, and ingredient inflation that never reversed. Even when wholesale food prices briefly cooled, menus stayed high because operators were already running on razor-thin margins. To keep the lights on, they raised prices again, even if it meant losing thousands of loyal customers. Once that cycle began, the industry crossed a point of no return. This inflation shockwave reshaped behavior nationwide. Households that once grabbed takeout on busy nights now cook at home out of necessity. Younger consumers, historically the backbone of fast casual chains, reduced visits more sharply than any other group. And with disposable income shrinking under rising housing, transportation, and debt costs, eating out became one of the first sacrifices. The result isn't a temporary slowdown. It's a fundamental change in how Americans engage with the restaurant industry. Chains aren't just facing slower foot traffic, they're confronting a structural decline in demand. And that collapse is already bleeding into earnings, stock prices, closures, and mass layoffs that are reshaping the entire economy. This shockwave is only the beginning. The fast food sector was built on one simple promise: quick, cheap, and predictable. But by 2025, that promise shattered in a way no one in the industry was prepared for. Menu prices didn't just rise, they spiked with historic force, turning the most budget-friendly brands into unaffordable luxuries for the very customers they depended on. McDonald's alone raised prices roughly 40% since 2019, with certain items surging by more than 200%. IHOP pushed increases near 80%, while Chipotle climbed around 70% in 5 years. These aren't marginal adjustments. These are numbers you'd expect from a currency crisis, not from a country claiming a strong economy. Fast food used to be the last stop for affordability. A meal that once cost $6 now lands closer to $10 or $12. A simple combo that was under $8 now touches $14 in some regions. For families earning stagnant wages and already drowning in higher rent, utilities, gas, and debt payments, that jump is devastating. Consumers didn't cut back because they wanted to eat healthier or save money for vacations. They cut back because the math simply doesn't work anymore. This price explosion didn't happen in isolation. It fed directly off the inflation shockwave, already reshaping consumer behavior. When restaurant inflation moves faster than income growth for multiple years in a row, the industry loses its most reliable customers, the middle and lower income households who used to generate the bulk of traffic. Once that customer base pulls away, sales don't just dip, they destabilize. The consequences became immediately visible in financial markets. Chipotle's stock dropped 21% in a single week after warning that younger consumers who once powered their growth no longer had disposable income. Wingstop's valuation slid over 26% across the year. Shake Shack fell more than 20%. Investors finally realized what consumers already knew. The price ceiling had been hit, and demand was collapsing. What makes this moment so dangerous is how it ties directly back to the broader economic breakdown. Fast food chains operate on volume. They can survive small price hikes, but they cannot survive losing millions of weekly customers. Once the core demographic pulls back, the entire model starts to fail. And that failure quickly spills into earnings, closures, bankruptcies, and layoffs. The price explosion didn't just make meals expensive. It severed the connection between fast food chains and the people who kept them alive. The financial damage inside America's restaurant sector is now impossible to hide. What began as price resistance from consumers has turned into a full-blown earnings collapse across the industry. Major chains that once felt untouchable are reporting losses at a scale that would have been unthinkable just a few years ago. KFC has posted $250 million in losses. Chipotle, despite aggressive price hikes, is down $150 million. Popeyes has recorded $91 million in negative performance, while TGI Fridays has fallen another $100 million into the red. Even well-known brands like Hooters, Denny's, Papa John's, Subway, and Hardee's are collectively bleeding tens of millions, with individual losses ranging from $10 million to $80 million. These aren't isolated setbacks. They're signs of an industry losing the financial oxygen that keeps it alive. When sales slow, margins evaporate almost instantly because restaurants depend on constant volume to cover expenses. Higher labor costs, insurance premiums, and lease rates only accelerate the damage. By the time a chain reports 9-figure losses, the internal cutting has already reached its limit. This meltdown links directly to the price explosion consumers faced. Once households rejected inflated menus, revenue collapsed. And when revenue collapses, profitability follows. Earnings reports across the sector now show the same pattern: declining traffic, shrinking check sizes, falling same-store sales, and rapidly rising operating costs. The numbers differ, but the message is identical. The fallout extends far beyond corporate spreadsheets. Earnings deterioration is the trigger for everything that comes next. The bankruptcy surge, the mass closures, the layoffs, and the unraveling of local economies built around these chains. Investors are already recalibrating expectations, recognizing that the old growth model no longer works in a landscape where the average household is financially exhausted. This isn't just a bad quarter. It's the moment the restaurant industry's financial structure cracked in full view. The earnings collapse didn't end inside corporate spreadsheets. It spilled directly into the most brutal phase of this crisis: widespread bankruptcies and mass closures across the country. By 2025, the restaurant industry entered one of the fastest die-offs ever recorded, with chains and independent operators folding at a pace the market has not seen in decades. More than 15 major food brands filed for bankruptcy in a single year. Total restaurant-related bankruptcies surged 50% year over year, a level that signals deep structural failure rather than a temporary correction. The sector now represents 12% of all U.S. bankruptcies, an astonishing share for an industry built on everyday consumer spending. The closures tell an even clearer story. Burger King is shutting down 377 locations. Hardee's is eliminating 145 stores. Jack in the Box is closing 120. TGI Fridays is cutting 100 restaurants from its footprint. Denny's is removing 90, Wendy's is shedding 72, and Applebee's and Popeyes are together eliminating nearly 60 more. These aren't isolated decisions. These are major retrenchments by brands that once blanketed American neighborhoods. This wave of closures reinforces the financial meltdown that started with vanishing foot traffic. When revenue collapses for months at a time, underperforming locations become impossible to carry. Rising rents, higher labor costs, and increasing insurance premiums magnify the burden until shutting the doors becomes the only remaining option. As stores disappear, the surrounding local economies lose jobs. commercial activity, and tax revenue, accelerating the decline. Independent restaurants, which lack the margin buffers and financing channels of large chains, are being hit even harder. Thousands have already gone dark, taking with them tens of thousands of jobs and decades of community presence. The industry is now projected to shed 20,000 positions just from major chain closures alone, a number likely understated given the speed of ongoing shutdowns. What's unfolding isn't a reshuffling or a routine market correction. It's a systemic die-off triggered by shrinking consumer spending power and unsustainable operating costs. And as closures spread, they feed directly into the next stage of the crisis, a shift in how Americans live, work, and spend that the economy is not prepared to absorb. The disappearance of middle and lower-income consumers from restaurants wasn't a choice. It was the result of an economic squeeze so intense that millions no longer have the financial space for even small indulgences. Over the past several years, the cost of living rose faster than household earnings at nearly every level. Rent increases in many cities exceeded 20%. Auto insurance rose more than 17%. Utilities climbed sharply, and groceries surged by hundreds of dollars per month for the average family. When everything essential becomes more expensive at once, discretionary habits collapse. The restaurant industry became one of the earliest casualties of this pressure. Households that once grabbed a quick meal after work or treated themselves on weekends now redirect every extra dollar toward basic survival. Consumers aren't weighing preferences, they're making sacrifices. For someone earning $45,000 to $60,000 a year, an $80 weekly takeout budget is no longer realistic when credit card balances keep rising and minimum payments grow heavier with every rate hike. Credit card debt itself hit a record $1.3 trillion, and delinquencies are climbing at the fastest pace since the financial crisis. Millions are living paycheck to paycheck with no cushion to absorb price shocks. When a family's budget breaks under rent, childcare, transportation, and food, eating out is the first thing to disappear. Not because people want to avoid restaurants, but because the margin for error is gone. This consumer retreat also reflects a deeper psychological shift. Constant price hikes have worn people down. The frustration of paying more for smaller portions, higher fees, and fewer rewards has eroded trust. Once consumers feel overcharged or stretched too thin, they pull back quickly, and in large numbers. The middle class reached that point years ago, and the lower income demographic never recovered from the initial inflation wave. What's happening now is a structural withdrawal. The spending power that once kept hundreds of thousands of restaurants afloat has evaporated. The earnings meltdown and wave of closures aren't random events. They are the direct consequence of a consumer base that simply can't carry the industry anymore. This collapse in demand creates a ripple effect that spreads far beyond restaurants, setting the stage for the broader economic breakdown already unfolding. One of the most misunderstood parts of this crisis is the belief that restaurant prices will eventually fall back to normal. They won't. Not because businesses don't want to lower prices, but because the financial system itself is engineered to keep them permanently elevated. The Federal Reserve targets 2% inflation every single year, even in healthy economic conditions. That means the baseline expectation is for prices to rise indefinitely. Declining prices, what economists call deflation, are treated as a threat, not a goal. This policy creates a permanent price floor. Even when wholesale food costs cool or supply chains stabilize, restaurants are never operating in an environment where lowering prices makes sense. Their rent, utilities, maintenance, insurance, and labor costs are locked into contracts built on rising inflation. A restaurant that tries to reverse prices risks losing margin in an economy where every expense keeps climbing. Once prices move up, they rarely go back. If the Fed were aggressively fighting inflation, this pressure might ease. But rate cuts have already begun, despite core inflation remaining above 3%, and food inflation still climbing in many regions. Cutting rates weakens the dollar, pushes asset prices higher, and keeps input costs elevated. For restaurants, that means higher loan payments, more expensive supplies, and another wave of wage increases to keep up with rising living costs among employees. This system traps consumers and businesses simultaneously. Households never get real relief because their spending power erodes every year, while restaurants operate in a permanent state of rising costs. When operators increased prices from 2019 to 2025 just to survive, they didn't create padding. They can now roll back. They simply kept their heads above water. This is why the industry can't respond the way consumers hope. Even if demand collapses, lowering prices isn't a viable option. Operators are carrying debt taken during the post-pandemic period, higher interest on credit lines, and leases negotiated during peak inflation. Cutting prices would accelerate insolvency. The economic environment created by policy decisions ensures that restaurant prices will remain high, and in many cases continue rising. And because consumers are already pushed to the breaking point, this pressure feeds directly into the next phase of the collapse. The collapse of the restaurant industry is not happening in isolation. It's unfolding alongside one of the most severe declines in the American job market in over a decade. A decline that is now feeding directly back into the same consumer crisis that crushed restaurant demand in the first place. The result is a feedback loop the economy is not equipped to handle. Job losses have surged past 1.1 million this year, the highest figure since the Great Recession, aside from the pandemic anomaly. October alone saw 153,000 layoffs, marking the worst October since 2003. These cuts are not scattered or random. They are concentrated in the sectors that employ tens of millions of Americans: retail, tech, warehousing, logistics, and service. When these industries pull back simultaneously, consumer spending breaks down at the foundation. As households lose income, restaurant traffic falls even further. And as traffic drops, restaurants lay off workers who then join the same labor market crisis that contributed to the decline. This circular collapse is already visible in the data. Job openings have fallen to their lowest level since 2021, suggesting not only widespread layoffs but also a shrinking pool of opportunities to replace lost income. On the corporate side, the surge in layoffs exposes a deeper divide between cost-cutting and structural failure. Companies like UPS have already eliminated over 40,000 jobs. Amazon is preparing for up to 30,000 additional cuts. General Motors is removing 5,500 positions. IBM is shedding an estimated 8,100 employees. In the tech sector alone, layoffs surpassed 141,000, a 17% jump from the previous year. Some of these cuts are traditional cost-saving measures meant to protect profit margins during uncertain periods. But the layoffs tied to consumer-facing industries reveal something more severe: a drop in demand significant enough to make staffing levels unsustainable. When restaurants, retailers, and service businesses let workers go, it's not because they're optimizing efficiency. It's because the customers who once supported those jobs have disappeared. This distinction matters because it shows that the labor market isn't experiencing a temporary adjustment. It's unraveling under economic pressure that extends far beyond rising interest rates or isolated corporate missteps. The layoffs driven by shrinking demand signal a structural shift in the economy, the same shift that has already dismantled large parts of the restaurant industry and is now spreading across the broader workforce. What emerges is a single, connected crisis: falling consumer spending, declining foot traffic, shrinking corporate revenue, and accelerating layoffs. Each element reinforces the others, pushing the economy toward a breaking point that becomes harder to reverse with every passing month. The narrative of a strong labor market has become one of the most misleading messages in the current economic environment. It's a headline repeated so often that many people accept it without looking at the underlying numbers. But when you examine the data beneath the surface, the picture changes dramatically. The labor market is not strong. It's weakening at a pace the official statistics fail to capture. The unemployment rate sitting at 4.3% sounds reassuring on paper, but that single number hides everything that truly reflects economic health: the surge in layoffs, the decline in job openings, the rise in underemployment, and the millions who left the labor force entirely. A metric that excludes those who stopped looking for work cannot accurately represent the stress people are feeling. For 2 months, the government hasn't even released the official jobs report because of the shutdown. That blackout leaves economists relying on private data that shows clear deterioration. ADP reported just 42,000 private sector jobs added in October, barely enough to offset the losses already recorded. And when revisions eventually appear, they tend to push previous job gains downward, revealing that earlier headlines were overstated. Meanwhile, layoffs exceed 1.1 million this year, the highest level since the financial crisis. Job openings have fallen to their lowest point since 2021. Government employment alone has dropped by more than 300,000 positions. None of this aligns with the idea of a strong labor market, yet the public is repeatedly told everything is stable. The disconnect grows worse when you consider the quality of jobs being created. Many new positions are part-time or low-wage, replacing full-time roles eliminated across retail, logistics, restaurants, and technology. A labor market cannot be considered strong when the standard of living attached to those jobs declines. The illusion is dangerous because it shapes policy decisions. When the labor market is framed as healthy, the underlying collapse in consumer financial stability goes unaddressed. But the evidence is clear. Between mass layoffs, shrinking opportunities, and rising financial strain, the workforce is under immense pressure. What looks stable from a distance becomes fragile up close. And that fragility is already feeding into the economic deterioration unfolding across every corner of the country. The most alarming part of this downturn is not the restaurant closures, the corporate losses, or even the surge in layoffs. It's the feedback loop forming between all of them. When restaurants lose customers, they cut staff. When those workers lose income, they pull back spending even further. That reduction in spending hits retailers, service providers, logistics firms, and eventually manufacturers. Each new decline sparks another. This is how an economic slowdown becomes a structural unraveling. Signs of this loop are already visible. Job losses passed 1.1 million, and openings fell to their lowest point in years. Major chains across multiple industries are shrinking headcounts simultaneously. Consumer debt hit $1.3 trillion, and delinquencies are climbing. Meanwhile, households aren't just spending less at restaurants, they're spending less everywhere. When millions reach the point where every dollar must go toward essentials, the entire economy begins to lose momentum. This erosion of demand creates a nationwide drag that hits local economies first. A single restaurant closure might eliminate a few dozen jobs, but multiply that across hundreds of closures and the ripple becomes enormous. Local tax revenue shrinks, borrowing costs rise, vacancies spread, and small businesses lose foot traffic. Once a region enters this cycle, growth becomes harder to restart. The breaking point comes when the system can no longer absorb the combined pressure of declining spending, rising debt, shrinking employment, and permanent price floors. Many parts of the country are already approaching that threshold. And if the trend continues, the next stage will not be a mild recession. It will be a long-term restructuring of the middle-class economy that affects every household, business, and community. What's happening right now is bigger than restaurants, bigger than layoffs, and bigger than inflation. It's a fundamental shift in how Americans live, work, and spend. Prices keep rising, incomes fall behind, and entire industries are losing the customers they once relied on. The numbers aren't pointing to a temporary slowdown. They're signaling a structural collapse unfolding in real time. And unless something changes, the economic landscape that shaped everyday life for decades may not return. This is the moment when the country must decide whether to confront the crisis or continue pretending it doesn't exist.